Welcome to the Voices That Propel Us, stories of justice, action, and community, a space where justice meets action and community voices rise. Each episode, we bring you stories from the front lines, changemakers, disruptors, and everyday heroes who are building a more just, equitable, and liberated world. This is more than a podcast. It's a call to listen, learn, and move together. You were just listening to music from the incredibly talented Stephen Kong. You can find him on Spotify and Bandcamp. Today we have with us Reverend Dr. Michael Woolf. Reverend Dr. Michael Woolf is a senior minister of Lake Street Church of Evanston and co-associate regional minister for the American Baptist Churches of Metro Chicago. A pastor, scholar, and activist, he works at the intersection of faith, justice, and interreligious solidarity. His forthcoming book, Confronting Islamophobia in the Church, Liturgical Tools for Justice, co-authored with Reverend Dr. Piela, equips Christians to resist anti-Muslim prejudice as an expression of discipleship. Through his ministry and writing, Woolf calls faith communities to embody courage, humility, and compassion in building a more just and pluralistic society. Well, hello. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. I'm really excited and grateful that you're here. I think you do such amazing and powerful work, and I can't wait to just explore more of that with you. And how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me to talk a little bit about some of that work, but it's a exciting day, lots going on at the church. So
Right. I can understand. So just to start off, your work sits at the intersection of faith, justice, and interreligious solidarity. So what experiences shaped your understanding of faith as a public good and not just as a private belief?
Yeah, so I'm of the firm belief that basically everything that we do is spiritual, whether that's what we eat or what we consume or our justice efforts or what we choose to pay attention to, that the sort of demarcation between sacred and profane is an artificial one. So I think that, of course, when we bring our faith into the public sphere, that's because our faith is supposed to teach us some sort of values. Hopefully those are good values, not necessarily. Faith is used in a lot of different ways to bring values into the public sphere. You've got the rise of white Christian nationalism, for instance, and all the sort of harm that I consider that it's doing in the world. And then you've got other ways of being faithful. I'm a Christian that's more involved in social justice efforts and trying to develop these sort of interfaith partnerships where we can take on the real issues of the world. To me, the solution is not sort of less religion, it's more religion and the right kind. But I think religion can be a really powerful force for good. When I was growing up, I grew up in a really religious sort of fundamentalist household, but then I was able over time to sort of change how I thought about the Christian tradition. And I ended up going to Harvard Divinity School, which is an interfaith divinity school. And so I got to have all sorts of folks who were part of my formation as a pastor who were from different religions. And I think that had a big impact on how I see the role of religion in the world.
That's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And what was the moment or encounter that first made you recognize the urgency of confronting Islamophobia within the church?
Oh, there's all sorts of ways that happens. So I mainly have pastored in context, and for the past 7 years, I've pastored in a context in which we put progressive Christianity in dialogue with other religions regularly in worship service. Beautiful. But I noticed that whenever I would put progressive Christianity in dialogue with Islam, I would get these sort of comments where people seem to think that was a strange conversation partner. And so instead of seeing Islam as sort of pure tradition, I think a lot of church people view it with suspicion and view Muslims in general with suspicion because being a follower of Islam has been sort of politicized in some ways. And so people think that it's a violent religion. People think that women are subservient in Islam when we have the exact same scriptures in Christianity that say pretty much the exact same thing. What I've found is that Christians are generally very generous readers of the Bible and very critical readers of something like the Quran, if they read it at all, or if they have any familiarity with it. Unfortunately, I think post 9/11, a lot of Christians are simply learning either these stereotypes through our media or through church services that are actively sort of teaching against the sort of pluralism that I think is the bedrock of our democracy.
Yeah, no, I think that's really beautiful. And, thank you for having those kind of conversations. I think it's so important, just like these, misperceptions that people have of the religion. But just in your experience, like having these kind of like important dialogues with folks, have you ever noticed like people having like these breakthroughs or like realizing the stereotypes that they have had? And have you seen like these being like powerful moments for folks?
Yeah, I mean, so we write a little bit about this, and my wife and I sort of co-founded a initiative that's called Challenging Islamophobia Together, Chicagoland, and we write a lot about the experiences of encounter and sort of how we can dismantle Islamophobia in the church in our book, Confronting Islamophobia in the Church, that's actually coming out this week. And so it's a very sort of exciting work because a lot of people just haven't really interrogated or thought about their relationship to Islam. Right. And so you get these really big Islamophobic instances in our culture. For instance, there was a congressional candidate in Texas who burned a Quran and said that it was, quote, powered by Jesus Christ. And so you get these sort of ways that Christianity is being used to foment Islamophobia. But you also have the opportunity to shift that and say, well, if people are learning how to be Islamophobic in church, that means that church is still capable of teaching people. And if people are learning bad things about other religions in church, they could also learn good things. They could learn how to treat other religions as peer traditions with really interesting insights about spirituality, about God, about our role in the world. So we have a lot of these conversations with people who honestly have never thought about it before. And so people have initial sort of experiences or something like at an iftar or one of our reading the Quran in churches event, and I think people walk away understanding that this is a pretty nuanced and interesting tradition that has a lot to say about God, and actually it could make me a better follower of my own faith if I understood some of those conversations and were in dialogue with it.
Yeah, no, that's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And how has your own spiritual journey evolved as you began engaging more deeply with Muslim communities and interfaith partners?
Yeah. So I graduated seminary and I could not really teach people about the Trinity because it's a very complex theological doctrine and it makes I don't know, it doesn't make a lot of intuitive sense, let's say that. But it has mystical meaning. I was very content to sort of hand wave that and say it's a mystery. But you really can't do that once you start engaging with something like the classical Muslim critiques from the 9th century about the Trinity and about the oneness of God. And so through reading those critiques and actually sort of wrestling with that, what ended up happening is I gained a lot better understanding of something like the Trinity. And that sort of happens all the time. I would say my engagement with Islam has made me a much better Christian because it's made me actually able to understand my faith from a different perspective. And so there's this classic quote from Max Muller that I think is really accurate. He says that the person who knows one religion knows none. And I think that that's really true. Wow. It's through comparison that we kind of can be able to really understand our own faith. And I think that comparison has been a really fruitful journey for me.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. I really love that. So you've said that addressing Islamophobia isn't only about compassion, but it's also about sustaining a pluralistic democracy. So how do you explain that connection to Christian communities who might be resistant to that idea?
Yeah, so how I explain that is that we can't just sort of do this work because that would make us like good people or like from a viewpoint of having all the power and benevolence is if you actually believe in this sort of project. And so I come from a tradition that we're separation of church and state. And the Baptist tradition is actually a core theological thing that we care about. And so that's part of the American project, and my faith tradition was a big part of influencing people to take that view. And I take that really seriously. I'm really proud of that. But churches have a big role that they can play in buttressing that project or completely tearing it down. So one of the things that we are fighting against right now is white Christian nationalism, which says that basically we should have a theocracy in this country and the church and the government should basically be one, that theology should be foreign and domestic policy, all these sorts of ideas. But that's not really what the country was founded on. In fact, it was founded on the exact opposite of that set of ideas. And so really what we can do is we can either give into that or we can fight it. And so I try to encourage folks to think about what freedom of religion really looks like in this country, even freedom of worship. Is it only for freedom for Christians to worship how they like? How can we think about those rights, and how can we extend them on? And then I try to ground that theologically. I try to talk to people about, what does love of neighbor look like? There is no real boundary around neighbors. It's also to love your Muslim neighbor, and how you love your Muslim neighbor is not to persecute them or not to foment hate acts against them, and perhaps to understand them better. So it's really not that hard to understand that there's really an opportunity here to engage from a faithful perspective, not just sort of, I want to be good and I want to do a good thing, or perhaps not just because I want to be a progressive political activist and sort of use my faith to do that, but actually because it's a core part of what we're asked to do as followers of Jesus.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I really love that. And, something that I notice has been really coming up through this podcast with like various guests are like recognizing unintentional biases, and also like recognizing not just also like just not being aware of the privileges that we carry. So with that, what are some of the subtle or unintentional ways that Islamophobia shows up in churches, even when people say that they're inclusive?
Oh, sure. So just complete ignorance and lack of knowledge about the religion and about the holy text. I think Christians are very willing to understand Jewish texts. If you talk to Christian pastors, they might know a little bit of Midrash or the Talmud. They might have some engagement with the sort of Jewish tradition, and there's a real comfort there. But there's not as much comfort with Islam. And so I think treating Islam as sort of a political ideology as opposed to a religion with insights about God would be another one. And like I said before, acting as if our own scripture does not have really complicated and difficult passages in it that sort of require interpretation and require us to develop some sort of new understanding of it. I mean, if you read scripture, it has a very intense and sort of conservative view about women's role in the church. But in my tradition, for instance, women have been able to be in leadership and be ordained for a long time. So I think it's one of those things that we have to use interpretation, we have to understand, and we have to also be willing to see through some of the lies that were being pitched all the time about violent extremism and all this sort of stuff. Islam is a tradition of peace. It has quite a firm commitment to peace and to the right ordering of society. It has a lot of really good social justice messages in the Quran, in Hadith, and all these sorts of places that you can go. It's just that Christians are completely unaware of that. So, I mean, I think it does, there are some extremist Muslims. That does exist. They're extremist Christians. And
that's what I was thinking too.
And so what I find is Christians are very hand-wavy about, they're willing to dismiss, it's not like they're real Christians. But instead, we want to make Muslims apologize corporately and take ownership corporately of every single Muslim who does anything in the world. And, not only is that Islamophobic, it's really problematic because Islamophobia really intersects with a whole host of different issues around anti-Blackness and racism, and also xenophobia. Intersects with immigration, and there's a reason why the Trump administration is going after folks in the Somali community in Minnesota right now. And so I think it dovetails with all these issues that we are trying to figure out as a country. And so I think it's really important that we try to marshal whatever we can to oppose Islam.
I really love that. And, I believe that too. I think we really need to go beyond the labels and, these stereotypes, and just see that we have more in common with each other than not. Yeah. Because, actually, for example, I studied this class when I was going to college, and it was, I think, the study of religion or something like that. But it was just talking about how there's different, like, just stories in like different religious, beliefs that are really similar to each other. I think like even like Noah's Ark or like these different stories. So it's like, we have more in common than like that we're divided. But I think it's just these labels sometimes that like turn people off. And, going to what you were saying too, I feel like it's just that narrative of, what it's like to, be a believer of Islam. Yeah, it just seems like when people have that faith, people jump all of a sudden to that versus like if it's, person of Christian background, it doesn't have that same like, blanket, like, belief. Yeah. And I think it just like, we really got to work to like dismantle these stereotypes too. And I think it's wonderful work that you're doing with folks.
Yeah. I think it's really important. So many people don't consider the ways that Christians are quite violent, and are spreading violence and extremism, and we have it right here domestically and internationally.
Right. No, thank you for sharing that. So, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but in your view, what does genuine interfaith solidarity look like beyond just surface level partnership?
Yeah, so I think the interfaith solidarity is not just about what I like to call falafel interfaith, which is where we all get together and we eat falafel.
Okay.
And that's fine. I mean, those partnerships are really important to build relationships. Eating together is one of the best ways that we can build relationships, but it has to go beyond that. And so I think that the reason why we're so keen to build these networks up and to connect sort of religious leaders together and followers of both these religions together is because we need to be able to stand with one another to be able to fight for the values that we have that are shared.
Yeah.
So that means working on projects in our communities. Means like trying to tackle something like the unhoused community, homelessness. How are we going to be able to help folks be able to be in homes? I mean, it's such a basic human right type thing, and both of our religions really believe in that. So I think that's a big deal. That's something that we would have to work on. There are projects in your local community that you can form these networks in. And I think it's also important that Christians show up for the Muslim community when there are anti-Muslim and Islamophobic acts of hate that often culminate in shocking acts of violence. And we've seen that especially in the world, I think, since the war in Gaza and the genocide there and everything has truly made things quite scary. So if you look at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding poll, American Muslim poll, they do something called the Islamophobia Index, and that index went up 8 points from in the past couple of years. So we're having big spikes in Islamophobia in the general population, but there are Christian groups, a lot of Christian groups are actually outpacing that 8-point gain. White evangelical Protestants had something like 14 points, and Roman Catholics had something like 12 points. So we're seeing a big rise in Islamophobia. I just read an article that it's all that folks in Texas and in Republican primaries are trying to outdo each other, basically, on fighting Islam. And that's what they're saying and all that sort of. I think that it's a real issue, and it's something that perhaps can recede a little bit from the headlines, but it's really important that we figure out how to stand in solidarity with one another, because I have no clue, honestly, what it would be like to be a religious, minoritized religious group in the United States, because I'm a white Christian, and basically all my holidays are days off school, and everything, the culture respects my religious beliefs in such a profound way. But I can use a little bit of that privilege to advocate for people who actually don't have the benefit of the doubt and aren't catered to as the hegemonic religious power.
Right. No, thank you for seeing that. And I think like I agree with you too. And it just like I feel like there's a lot of discourse around like people feeling like, oh, now, Christianity is under attack. We have to walk on eggshells and, stay happy holidays instead of Merry Christmas. But I feel like it just like people feel like, I don't know. Because I've learned about that too. Like folks more in like privilege, like feel like it's an attack when it's like, other people with lived experiences. This has just been our normal. But like, even if you think about it, like when we look at our money, it says in God we trust. And I feel like, just Christianity is still very widespread. But I think what I've been hearing from, just a lot of different people is just like, oh, I don't feel safe, being a Christian anymore. Well, it's like, well, I don't know if that's because I don't know if you've noticed that, but it's just I've heard like just folks talking about that, just with this administration, just people feeling like that when, other people's lived experiences that might have been, their way of life, their whole lives.
Yeah, I don't know how you could be an oppressed Christian in the United States, especially with this administration. It's just not happening here. I mean, you might be witnessing the erosion of some societal privilege that has been given to Christianity as religiosity in general declines. But that has nothing to do with you being discriminated against. It has everything to do with the fact that the assumed power and influence and prestige that you thought would accompany it, being a Christian, might be diminishing. And so, to that, womp womp, sad trombone noise, I think people can get over that.
Yeah, no, I love that. And, so I don't know if you feel this too, but just there's so much divisiveness right now. And I feel like, that's why I wanted to do this podcast too. I feel like we just need to talk to each other more and recognize that human connection that we have with each other. So how can faith communities model democratic values such as empathy, humility, and courage at a time when public discourse is so fractured?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's really good. Empathy is actually under attack theologically. A lot of conservative Christians think that empathy is a sin.
Wait, really?
Which is
can you expand more on that? I've never heard that before, actually.
Yeah, empathy is definitely a hot button word for the Christian right now, which is very focused on the fact that empathy or feeling another's pain or sympathizing with another person is actually sinful. So this is sort of a complete misconstruction and a perversion, really, of what the Bible says, which is basically compassion is super important. Being able to have compassion for people. I couldn't imagine Jesus Christ lacking empathy. That would be sort of weird. So I think that what you're seeing is a real attempt to marshal religion to go against these sorts of values. But the core of the message has always been there. And so I think it's about preaching, it's about worship, it's about going out into the community and saying, look, the values that the church is founded on are mercy and grace, forgiveness, truth, all these sorts of good things that are good for society. It's not based on discrimination or racism or fighting wars or all the sorts of stuff that people want to pervert it to do. So I think that's what we have in common across religions, is that these are values-based organizations that care about these values, that really actually want to put those values in the world, and that challenge us to be the best humans that we can be, to be fully human, as opposed to giving in to our most base instincts that we could give into those base instincts. I think we live in a world right now that's giving into them quite a bit. But we are called to do something higher. We're called to be better than that. And I think that those values are still really important. Even as religion sort of wanes and diminishes and people go to church less or, that kind of thing, those values are not going anywhere. They're really important to bring out into the world.
No, thank you for bringing that up. Actually, that is new to me. I've never heard empathy as a sin, because I thought that they teach just service and, filling other people's pain. Where do people get that from? Do they have biblical backing for it, or where did they, even? I guess I'm kind of flabbergasted right now. How did they?
So I think they root it in stuff like it's a moral compromise, that empathy can make you feel with someone rather than guiding them towards truth or correction. Or it's a manipulation where your sort of feelings are in charge and they override principles. And I guess they would say compassion's okay, because that's acting against the ultimate good, but they're trying to make honestly being a good person a sin. It's very popular on the right now. So I definitely look it up. It's wild.
No, I gotta look that up. No, thank you for sharing that with me.
That's why we have to have movements like this. That's why it's not just about confronting Islamophobia. It's building these interfaith solidarity networks. And the book really goes into how do you do that? What does the work look like? The last chapter is all 10 tips for getting started, because, my wife, who I co-wrote the book, and Reverend Dr. Anna Piela, and I wrote this book, and she's my wife, and we work on this stuff together, and we worked on it really hard, but we made a lot of mistakes along the way, right? And so we try to help people jumpstart this interfaith solidarity building, because our world needs it so much right now.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And I'd love to talk with you more about the book as well. So, your book, Confronting Islamophobia in the Church, offers tools for justice. So can you tell me more about what inspired you and your co-author to approach this work and really, delve deep into this kind of topic?
Yeah, we wrote the book that we wish we had when we started. So I was looking around for these sort of, one of the things that it does is it's not just sort of Islam for Christians, like Islam 101. It does have a section about that. It does explain what Islamophobia is, but it's really theologically driven. Like, how do we build a Christian understanding of why we ought to do interfaith partnership and what that looks like? So there's a chapter that's in there that focuses on that quite a bit. And then we've got the last two chapters are what's called lectionary commentaries. And so lectionary is the set of readings that Christian churches all throughout the world are all reading on the same week. And so there's lectionary commentary that places hadith and Quranic passages in conversation with the lectionary and the sort of the biblical passages that are the assigned reading, and gives people easy tools. If a pastor picked it up, they could preach a sermon that was in dialogue immediately. Or they could lead a Bible study, and you can look wicked smart if you've got this book. You can look wicked smart because you can say, "Oh, well, did you know about this passage in the Quran where Jesus is portrayed differently because Jesus is in the Quran? He's a very important prophet, for instance." So there's all these sort of instances where I wish I had that. There was no online resource that would help me pull up relevant citations, so we made one, and I think that's the beauty of it. And this is my second book, and I feel like each time the most important task is to write the book that you wish you had when you were starting out. Write the book that no one wrote and that you wish they had because it would have made your life a lot easier. That's always a good bet.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. That's really beautiful. And, I'd love to talk with you more about worship practices in specific. So just a little bit about me. When I was younger, I went through like a lot of religious trauma, and I was like kind of like turned off to like, traditional religion, even, just like the structure and everything. I think that's really a growing point for me, and me really trying to open my heart to that. So I'd love for you to talk about this, but how can worship practices, so this includes like music, prayer, or ritual, be used more to move congregations from fear into like faithful engagement?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that I do, I spend my week doing, I just did for the whole month of February, is trying to match up these different themes throughout, let's say an hour-long worship service that help you get to the core message of whatever you're placing in dialogue, and what's the core message that you want people to walk away from. You want to give them hope. I try to give people a lot of hope. I really think the moral arc of the universe is long, but bends towards justice, and it's really long, and it might not be in our lifetime. But I really do think love wins at the end of the day, and I want to be on the winning side of that for sure. So I want to bring more love into the world. I want to encourage people to bring more love into the world. So it's about hope and courage and how we do that. I think the music is supposed to lift you up. It's supposed to make you think about the themes that you're supposed to be doing. But ideally, a worship service is going to help us be better people. Go into the week. Or if you're walking into a worship service and you got a bunch of anxiety about stuff going on in your life, it's a little break. It's just a little moment to say, this is not the end of the world, and it's not the success or failure of this endeavor is not going. There's at least one supreme being for whom it matters very little. I think that's really helpful, because it can feel like the judgment of our peers is so important. Or we can feel like, how do we stand up for justice in a world in which you can get killed for doing that if you want to stand up to ICE officers, right? So I mean, that's really something for us to ponder and consider. It's risky sometimes to bring love into the world, and how can we build that justice? But I think it's all the things. We read poetry a lot at the end of our worship service, and I always think that that's like a really nice ending. Ideally, the best parts of worship are really supposed to help us access the best parts of us as humans. We're complex morally, and we can do so much good and so much evil. We're neither good nor evil, I don't think. But we have limitless potential in either direction. But I think that wrestling with that and understanding that there's so much good that could be possible. And trying to awaken that in ourselves. That's a very human thing to want to coax out of ourselves.
No, that's really wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And, I'd love to hear about like what you hope that readers will walk away with. So what transformation do you hope that readers and congregations experience when they use these tools?
Look, I hope that they understand that they have a lot of power right? So like one of the things that
Okay.
one of the bright spots, I talk to pastors who are depressed all the time because no one
Okay.
comes to church, and post-COVID it's really difficult and all
Yeah.
that sort of stuff. But one of the things I say is that, look, these institutions still have power to form people and to move them closer towards like love and compassion and justice and all these sorts of things. That's really exciting.
Yeah.
It's not like people woke up and decided that they don't care about these things anymore. They just really don't care about institutional religion. That's a very different statement. They still care about all that stuff. It's just up to us to try to continue to push that conversation towards that. So what I hope people walk away from this book with is a sense that there's still magic there. There's still power that can be unlocked. There's still the ability for us to do so much good in the world and to be able to make that happen if we want to, and so the book gives people tools to do that. I think that that's super important because, again, it's a hope question. I think a lot of people are losing hope. They need hope. I think this book is fundamentally hopeful, not just for Christians, but for our world, that it could be possible to put our democracy back together again, that it could be possible to have meaningful change, that the Christian tradition isn't just sort of taken over by conservatives and completely broken, that it can still do really cool stuff. So that's the hope for the book.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I want to go into that more too. But wait, what world do you think is possible if more people learn how to like live in hope versus living in fear?
Oh, I mean, I think that that's how love wins. I really do. I think that if we stay hopeful, then I really think that there can be sort of a values-based revolution that takes place in our world. I think you're seeing that a little bit right now. The latest polling shows some 60% of Americans want to abolish ICE or get rid of ICE.
How much? You said 65%?
Yeah. So
Wow. Okay.
yeah. So I mean, that's the disapproval rating of ICE anyway.
Wow.
I guess the plurality, there was a plurality of people who wanted to abolish it, and so I think that is. That gives me some hope that normal people who are looking at striking brutality and oppression, reject that. And so I think that, again, these values are still really important if we stay hopeful as opposed to being completely subdued. And I've done a lot of anti-ICE work and continue to do that. I think that if we stay hopeful, we're more effective resistors. We're more able to bring about that values-based revolution.
Okay, cool. No, that's so beautiful. And how do you think that churches can cultivate resilience against fear-based narratives that pit communities against each other?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's a reason why the most common and most repeated line in the Bible is "Do not be afraid." It's because a lot of scary stuff was happening at that time, and these were regular people. That I think it's easy with 2,000 years removed, and they're in the Bible, so they must be like something really special. But I firmly believe that these are ordinary people. Jesus literally called fishermen to be his disciples. These are normal folks, and so I think that when we look at that, we see normal people able to do some really extraordinary things, and I think that's what I'm after, is how can I tap into that, and how can I be brave? How can I be able to continue to bring to bear my values in this world? And I think that is so important, is teaching people how to make their values not just things that we sort of think about, but really things that we bring out and are alive in the world. And so I think that's really the task before us, and what gives me a lot of hope every day is helping people do that.
Yeah, no, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing. And something else that I want to do with this podcast is have my listeners feel empowered that they can also make a difference and changes, in like these different topics that I'm exploring through the guests in the podcast. So with that, for Christians who want to confront Islamophobia but just don't know where to start, what is one small concrete step that they could take, even if it's, this week?
Sure. I read the Quran a little bit. Just see it for what it is. A beautiful really book that is tracing God's work in and through regular people and through history. And just see it for what it is, which is there's a lot of beauty there. If people
Yeah.
can do that, I think that they can come a little bit closer to understanding that this is a pretty venerable and important dialogue partner for them.
Yeah, no, definitely. No, I've been studying a little bit myself too, and I just think it's such a beautiful religion. And, that's why I love the work that you're doing to really dismantle these stereotypes and show like
Sure.
there's something more than, just what these labels were putting on. So, I'd like for you also to speak to my non-Christian listeners as well. So, what advice do you have for non-Christian listeners who want to build solidarity with people of faith doing this kind of work?
Sure. Well, iftar season is coming up, and a lot of
Okay.
iftars, a lot of mosques are going to put on an iftar that's going to invite community members in, and you don't have to be
Mm-hmm.
Muslim to go. So, what
Yeah.
I would recommend is that you form relationships and you continue to work on this, because obviously I'm speaking to church people a lot in the book, but not
Okay.
exclusively. I mean, I think there's a lot there that people who aren't Christian could pick up and use and think
Mm-hmm.
about. But at the same time, I really I think that this is really important work, again, to build a pluralistic democracy, to strengthen our
Yeah.
communities, to do the sort of basic work and the basic tasks that we have before us. And
Yeah.
so I would encourage folks to go to an iftar to build those relationships and to find something in your community to work on. It can be very basic. It can be very
Okay.
simple. But I think that interfaith work isn't just about like eating falafel together. It's about
Right.
taking on projects. It's about standing up for shared
I love
values. It's
that.
about coming together and understanding what those shared values are ahead of time so that we can put them in action.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. So, I'd love to just go back to hope again. So, what gives you hope right now? And, with that, what moments or movements remind you that a more just, pluralistic society is possible?
Yeah, I mean, I get hope from a lot of the communities who have come out against ICE. I think that that's
Yeah.
really where I'm focused on, and who have rejected immigration cruelty, and whether those are faith communities or just regular neighbors. I think that example of resilience is so important.
Uh-huh.
And it shows what normal people can do. And I think that also carries me forward and gives me hope that normal people can also dismantle something like Islamophobia, and that they
Yeah.
can put in the trash bin and the rubbish bin of history, and we can
Mhm.
be able to move on to a better place. But it's normal people. Again, it's normal
Yeah.
people. It doesn't take extraordinary people. It takes normal people doing extraordinary
Right.
things. And
Right.
there are a lot of extraordinary acts of mercy and truth that are happening right now.
Yeah, no, no, no. Thank you for sharing that. And, if you could imagine the church 20 years from now embodying its highest calling towards justice and pluralism, what do you think that would look like?
Well, it probably wouldn't have so many big buildings to maintain, and it
Okay.
would be much more
Uh-huh.
um, able to bring those resources out in the community. If it did have those buildings, it would open
Uh-huh.
its doors more. And I think that to stop seeing the church as something that needs to be protected and start seeing it as something that needs to be shared. And
Mm.
it's not in like an evangelistic way, like people need to share the good news or
Yeah.
anything like that. But the resources, the values-based understandings that we have of our role in the world, all this sort of stuff needs to be shared, and people need to be invited into that in local communities. And I think that
Mm.
if that happens, that's going to include collaboration naturally with our Muslim neighbors and neighbors of other faiths, Buddhist neighbors,
Yeah.
Sikh neighbors, Jewish neighbors, all sorts of folks. And I think that if the church can find its voice also on issues of moral import and
Yeah.
speak boldly for justice, basically I'm done with any faith-based institution that, for instance, hasn't called for the abolition of ICE.
Right.
I think
Right.
that there is a real opportunity here for normal,
Uh-huh.
everyday religious people to reclaim the narrative from people who, frankly, are using religion to do quite evil things.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And just as we're closing out, I had a wonderful time talking with you today. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So, just going back to what you were saying earlier, I feel like there's a lot of people who want to do good and just don't know where to start. And I don't know. Sometimes I get caught up in my little world too, thinking like, oh, no one cares, or who's doing the work. And
Yeah.
I think that's why I wanted to do this podcast too, to show people that there's a lot of wonderful people out there, doing the best they can. And I want to show people you don't need just your, a degree or like big accomplishments. Like just everyday acts can really make a difference. So that's why I thought of the title, "Voices That Propel Us." Like, who are the voices that are really helping to propel us us toward a better future for everyone. So yeah, with that, what does propelling us forward or propelling us toward a more just world mean to you personally?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of ways to be
Hmm.
propelled to a more just world.
Yeah,
I feel like we are a country in quite a bit of crisis right
right.
now. I think it's a very tumultuous time,
Yeah, no, I
and
agree.
I think if we could again live our values sort of in this world, if we
Right.
could practice a little more grace with one another, a little more mercy, a little more truth, if we could repudiate, frankly, the fascism that we see
Hmm.
rising in this country, and say that the idea that we could ever deport millions of people and it would be kind or
Yeah,
good.
yeah,
If we could put that away and say that we really reject that idea and we understand that we can't ever do that again, I think that
yeah.
that would be a good start. I think that religious people are a part of that. Non-religious people are a
Hmm.
part of that. We're going to need everybody at the helm.
Yeah.
Everybody working really hard to bring that about. I think it's really
Yeah.
important, and I think that we can chart a future and a path, but it's a pluralistic path. It's one where
Hmm.
not everybody's the same, and that's okay. And if we could get over some of our sense that
Yeah.
exactly what you're saying, despondency, then maybe
Hmm.
we might be able to act. If we don't give in to despair, then we might be able
Right.
to act. You know, I think that's really important.
Yeah, no, thank you. And, again, thank you for your time. Thank you for this really beautiful conversation. You're doing amazing work and just making incredible contributions. And I wish you all the best. And just lastly, how can people find you if they would like to connect with you?
Yeah, so I'm on Blue Sky at
Okay.
Reverend Michael Wolf,
Uh-huh.
and I'm on Instagram at Reverend Dr. Michael Wolf. It's Wolf with
Uh-huh.
two O's, and you can just Google me, and my website comes right up.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you again. I can't wait to see what else is coming. And you said is your book's not out yet, is it? Or is it about to come out? Okay.
It's out. I
Oh, it
mean,
is out.
if
Okay.
you go, it's just
Okay,
that you
cool,
can't buy
cool.
it on Amazon yet. And I think in the
Okay,
next
okay. I
couple
gotta
of
look for that.
days,
Okay,
it will be
cool, cool.
available on Amazon.
Okay,
So
perfect. No, I
that's the
definitely
big
plan to
thing.
check that
It
out.
is available on Kindle, but
Okay,
the paper copy is not available on Amazon. And we
okay.
want folks, to be able to buy the book, of course, because
Yeah,
I think it's
definitely.
really important reading.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again. I had a wonderful time talking with you, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks. If you could just put the book in the
Sure.
show notes, that would be
Mhm.
great.
Of course. Thank you.
All right, thanks. See ya.
Okay, bye. Thank you for being here and tuning in to Voices That Propel Us, stories of justice, action, and community. Your presence in this movement matters. If today's conversation moved you, share it, talk about it, and keep the work going. Together, we're not just imagining change, we're making it. Until next time, stay bold, stay grounded, and stay in the fight.
Every time I feel so mad and sad and bad, I say to myself, relax, lean back, it's a brand new day. And every time I feel so down that a frown is all that's on my face, I remind myself to take a breath, it's a brand new day.